You can see now my screen? Okay.
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning from Montreal. Thank you very much for having me here and for organizing this amazing workshop. All the presentations are being exciting, and sorry in advance for if you can hear some background noise, because there are some renovation in the building right now. So I'm going to try to talk aloud. So my plan for today is to walk you through a story that I have been trying to put together, focusing on the impact of sociolinguistic context on language processing and cognition. Well, I am Antonio Iniesta. I'm from Spain, but I have recently joined the Language and Multilingualism Lab as a postdoctoral research to work in different projects related to reading and writing in multilingualism. So researching bilingualism is essential and is growing more and more every day, as you can see, considering that the speaking several languages is the rule rather than the exception across the world. So globalization has intensified the mobility and communication between different countries, different cultures, with a consequence necessity to acquire more and more bilingual competencies, especially in English, because it's the default language, as fundamental to personal and professional success. For example, in Europe, we see an amazing increase of bilingual competence as a consequence of the implementation of bilingual programs in schools in countries with a strong monolingual tradition. Research in bilingualism used to be considered a super specific topic that only people in a very specific context might be interested in. Fortunately, there has marked change in our understanding bilingualism, as illustrated here by this boom of research over the past 2 decades, becoming as a multidisciplinary topic that is highly socioculturally relevant, with impact of economic outcome, socio-emotional well-being, political attitude, many between others. What have we learned about the recent research of bilingualism? It's well recognized that bilingual are not simply two monolingual in one person. Bilingual is not a single dichotomous construct, and bilingual can vary amongst many dimensions like language ability, exposure of language use. So we know that both languages are active when bilingual listen to or read or write in each of the two languages. So the representation of the target and non-target language are active in parallel and can compete for selection. So this joint activation has an impact on the demand of cognitive resources dedicated to language processing. And this suggests that bilingual must be able to control and regulate that competition to communicate it in the target language. And many proposals defend that the persistent activation and competition of the non-target language is managed in part by general executive control mechanism. But important in this context is the impact of the environment of language processing and cognitive processing, because some important models defend that the context where two or more languages are used may be particularly demanding for language control processing, but also for general cognitive processing. So how we can explore this effect of international context of linguistic and cognitive processing? Different studies over the last year have been explored this international context from different perspectives, considering the impact of the interlocutor that you are talking with, the impact of the local context or the immediate context, your family, your work, or more general impact of the global context, the city, the country. Considering the first one, the interlocutor, this study explored the effect of the interlocutor on flanker tasks. I apologize to the authors who are here today for the simplification that I did here, but participants show before each flanker trial an interlocutor as a queue. But each interlocutor was introduced as balanced or unbalanced bilingual in a previous phase. So the idea here is that in the scenario A, where a balanced bilingual is interacting with a balanced interlocutor, he can use more monitoring that inhibition. So with both languages are highly co-activated. Whereas in the scenario B, where a balanced bilingual is interacting with a low L2 proficiency interlocutor, the speaker needs to inhibit the L2. This study is much more complex, but in this particular scenario that I use as an example, the results show more conflict effect after unbalanced interlocutor, as evidence that particular interlocutor require a specific type of cognitive settings. Other recent studies show that bilinguals can adjust their expectation of code switching depending on the communicative context. For example, participants in this study read some sentence with switch or not switch condition in the company of another person that was introduced as bilingual or monolingual. The results here show an early frontal positivity effect in switching condition as usual, but which this effect was large when bilingual were in a situation in which code switching was inappropriate, in this case, in the presence of a monolingual interlocutor. Considering the local effect or the local context, the immediate context, our study showed that the language coactivation that underline this cognitive control effect can be modulated by the context in which bilingual use their languages. For example, in this study is a writing to dictation paradigm, and participants from Florida have to type word in English or Spanish, but we manipulated orthogonally the orthographic and phonological similarity between languages in 4 conditions. So we include 2 groups of participants, late bilingual and heritage speaker, with a similar use of English because they use English in a formal and informal context. However, the use of Spanish was different because heritage speaker use Spanish with families, friends in an informal way, mainly using spoken modalities, whereas bilingual use Spanish in the university formal context with more orthographic or visual input. The results show that heritage speaker continue showing phonological effect and slower reaction times in the late phase of writing processing, in the sublexical processing, especially in Spanish. So what we suggest that the sublexical processing in heritage speaker bias toward phonological information, trying to compensate their orthographic limitation. So in this result, the context that they are using their language was mediating the strength and modality of the coactivation. Considering the more global context, different interactional contexts regarding the country can produce important difference in terms of language use or language diversity. For example, in this study, the author compared 3 locations with totally different linguistic and cognitive requirements: Spain, Puerto Rico, and US. And this difference result in different degrees of competition versus cooperation between languages. Sorry. In Spain and US, both with a competition pattern between languages, the results show an effect of cognitive control, proactive or reactive, in naming latency, or in this case, naming accuracy. However, in Puerto Rico, where there is a cooperation between languages, the cognitive control didn't have any effect of naming. So the context is mediating if you are using your cognitive resources to control your language or not, depending of if a cooperation or competition context. So considering my current location, Canada, we can see, for example, 2 cities with different language diversity and language use as Montreal and Toronto. Here you can see the census data considering the native language, where red means English speakers and blue means French speaker. And we can see that Montreal is a super bilingual city with a lot of mainly French, but with a lot of variability of English and coexistence of English and French compared to Toronto, that is mainly English speaking with some population of Chinese speaker, but more cluster, no spreading across the city. But multilingualism can be super heterogeneous because, for example, this is my lab with people from different cities in Canada or different countries as US, Puerto Rico, Mexico, Turkey, Italy, Morocco, or Spain. So we are living and working in Montreal, but we have important difference between us in terms of language that we know, different linguistic histories, different use, social distribution of language, social status, identity, a lot of differences. So how we can organize such experiential complexity? I want to use this space and this presentation as a call to action to more fully embrace sociolinguistic, sociocultural experience as part of our theoretical and empirical work. And for this purpose, I am going to present a framework proposed in my lab as an approach to operationalize this complexity. Considering the importance of social context and social experience, we present here a comprehensive, socially situated system framework of bilingualism to understand how sociolinguistic context can influence people language use, develop, or cognition at different levels. As you can see in the middle of the framework, there is an ego. Ego in this case is one particular speakers, me, you, whatever speaker in a context that they are receiving the influence of different social sphere. The interpersonal language dynamic is the first sphere of influence, which involves person-to-person interaction. Then we have ecological language dynamic, that is the second sphere of influence that involves local social context, that is neighborhood, school, workplace. Then we have the society language dynamic in the third sphere of influence that involve higher order characteristics of the society as language attitude, belief, status, policy. And finally, we have temporal dynamic on the system that change over the time with influence of the historical event, like now with the COVID experience, something more temporal. The challenges associated with this system framework were to try to organize, operationalize, and quantify each sphere and test if each sphere can predict something about bilingualism behavior. The first level in the interpersonal related to the person-to-person interaction, we needed a tool to quantify the social, cultural, and psycholinguistic experience of individual people. So some studies have pointed out that language use can be the best predictor of language and cognitive outcomes. Indeed, in our group, we are working with data that pointing out that self-report language use can be the less contextual bias self-report measure in comparison with proficiency, age of acquisition, or another measure. And this is a measure that the general linguistic background questionnaire include asking the percentage of use of L1, L2, L3, different questions. With this information, we propose to compute language entropy that reflect the overall balance of language use across multiple communicative contexts. Entropy is a continuous index from high entropy score to low entropy score that is calculated by the percentage use of each language, and we can compute the entropy index that where a balanced language use result in a high entropy, indicating high diversity or integrated or balanced use of multiple languages within a context, and low entropy indicate low diversity or compartmentalized use of language in this specific context. Entropy has been shown as a good predictor of enhancement of cognitive control. An increase in general entropy was associated with greater engagement of proactive control and also with greater functional connectivity in the brain network associated with language and executive control. So we have the first sphere. The second level related with the people in the neighborhood, the school, workplace, or family can be explored using social network methodologies to capture the overall composition of the social environment. If the participant is the ego and the people they interact with are the alters, we can ask participants for different information related with alters and related with the relation between ego alter and between alter, as gender identity, age, education, city, type of relation, frequency of interaction, closeness, language that you use, etc. And we can compute different social network measures as size, ties, density, centrality, or strength, between others, that we can use to predict something behavioral or neural about bilingualism. With the social network measure, we compute 3 subnetworks related with the information of the alter provided by the participant. Mainly, we have an English monolingual network, French monolingual network, and bilingual subnetwork. So we have the use of English alone, the use of French alone, and the use of both languages with my different alters. In this is an example of different network, including this study, with different patterns of English, French used by different alter with different closeness and different density. As a general result, the egos report feeling closer to their bilingual alters in comparison with monolingual alters. And the bilingual subnetwork demonstrate highest density, that is more alter-alter interconnection. So in this study, bilingualism can work as a salient social identity that cultivate group affiliation that I feel more close with. We use each subnetwork to try to predict language use in our participants. So here you can see that conversation in English, the percentage of use of English in your daily life, increase when the personal French network decrease, but when the English personal network increase. And however, we found the contrary pattern in French. Conversation in French increase when the French personal network increase, but the English personal network decrease. However, the bilingual network was not capturing the effect in both languages in a super good way. We found exactly the same pattern to predict lexical proficiency. So English lexical increase when the French personal network decrease, but the English network personal increase. And the contrary in French, the French lexical increase when the French personal network increase, but the English network decrease. Again, the bilingual network was not capturing the effect in both languages in this participant. So the influence of bilingual context needs to be explored in this special Montreal participant from a more global perspective. For this reason, we explore ecological level in a greater extent, and we collected census data considering the postal code of our participant to characterize the ecological language pattern. So we compute an overall index of English use for each neighborhood, as well as an overall index of French, and also we calculate a language diversity for each neighborhood using a qualitative variation index. In this case, this new language diversity index was a good predictor for both language use and lexical proficiency in English and French. To explore the third sphere related to society language dynamic, we explore the cultural and policy differences between two cities in this case. Specifically, we selected two places with different exposure to bilingualism and different social status of bilingualism. Montreal is a metropolitan city with French English as official language, with a high proportion of immigrants and international students, and where multilingualism is the norm. However, Gainesville is a small college town in US where only English is the official language with a high proportion of Spanish immigrants, but with an Anglocentric hegemony. That what means that they have negative attitude toward language diversity, especially toward Spanish or Latin speakers. So the difference in language use were evident exploring the entropy of participants, being the entropy higher for Montreal participants. So they use more diverse language in their daily life. But this group of participants, they perform a writing to dictation task where the participants have to type the sentences that they heard. So the input was presented orally with three different accents: American, British accent, or Indian accent. And each of the input was associated with a face, with two specific faces in the screen, or white face or South Asian face. And each face was presented with each three accents. No? The results show a less accurate transcription when the input was presented in Asian face, but only in Gainesville participant, in the US participant, not in the participant from Montreal. In addition, participants were asked to judge the attentiveness of the speaker. So having the same audio in this specific condition, Indian English input for South Asian face or white face, people in Gainesville rate as more accent the South Asian face. However, the participants from Montreal did not rate differently both faces because they have the same input. So this differential mechanism during attentiveness judgment in Gainesville and Montreal suggests that the social meaning of the race have different values in these two locations, and this affect language comprehension and language production because the main task was writing to the station. So we have this part of comprehension, this part of production. So much more work is needed to complete and refine this model that we propose, but it's a theoretical and methodological approach as a starting point to fully embrace sociolinguistic, sociocultural, bottom-up, but also top-down influence as part of our theoretical or empirical work. I will end saying muchas gracias. Thank you very much for having me. I'm happy to take your question, and feel free to email me or Deborah with any question in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk, Dr. Iniesta. If there are any questions in the audience, we'll quickly take one before we run out of time.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a question because I think that at McGill, they're doing something very important in the area of bi-multilingualism research. The idea of entropy is very, very important. It quantifies, although I think this idea comes from physics, I once dealt with it in a different context, but measuring entropy with regard to the practice of bi-multilingualism and then linking it to cognition is very important. It's a way forward. So I have had the chance to read their papers, but I was just, the similarity with which we are thinking things in Hyderabad and in McGill, in Leiden is astounding. This is why these conferences are important. We're thinking, we may end up doing a little bit different thing, but the idea is more or less the idea of context, social variables, language use, and proficiency and control. They're very similar.
Now we are trying to refine this entropy measure because at this point we don't have in entropy, we can separate the cooperation with the competition pattern. We can measure the use of the language, but not in the way that you are using, no? Because in Puerto Rico and Montreal, you can have the same high level of entropy, but here can be more cooperative or more, no? So we are trying to explore how can divide or how can include this type of
Yes,
pattern in the entropy.
and
measure.
this
Yeah.
also opens the possibility of using data science, the ideas or practices of data science, and
Yeah.
bringing it close to the theoretical ideas of, a mind's in a network in a space, and then the more number of people speaking one language, they may develop more strong bond, and then that might influence the other groups' control or responses. So these ideas can take us into more fascinating territories. So I'll just, the PhD students or other students who are listening or who would listen later, the recorded videos would find ideas to do further research. Thank you anyway.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
for your
that's from
comments.
me. Thank you.
Thank you once again. Then we should move